High above the red rock cliffs of Arizona, where the desert meets the sky and the wind whistles through canyons, stand motels that cling precariously to the edge of the earth. By day, they appear abandoned yet picturesque, their balconies overlooking deep valleys and jagged cliffs. By night, the air changes. Shadows stretch along crumbling walls. Doors creak with no one entering or leaving. And whispers echo from rooms long vacant. Visitors report seeing figures in the windows, staring silently at the cliffs below. Some hear footsteps in hallways where no one walks. Lanterns and lights flicker with no electricity, and objects move on their own. Some swear that the cliff itself groans under unseen weight, as if the land remembers the tragedies that unfolded above the desert floor. Tonight, my dear friend, we will step into these haunted cliffside motels. We will walk along precarious balconies, peer into abandoned rooms, and listen to whispers carried by the wind. We will uncover the most haunted cliffside motels in Arizona, where every balcony, every cracked tile, and every room holds a story, and the restless refuse to leave. So tell me, if you were alone in a cliffside motel at midnight, and a shadowy figure appeared at your doorway, staring silently. Would you step closer to see who it is, or would you retreat to safety before the shadows notice you? Hello, my dear friend. I am so glad you are here tonight, safe and warm, because the motels we are about to explore are not for the faint of heart. Arizona's cliffs are legendary for their beauty, yet among the rocks lie motels abandoned by travelers, torn by time, and haunted by tragedy. Yet among the rocks lie motels abandoned by travelers, torn by time, and haunted by tragedy. Abandoned by travelers, torn by time, and haunted by tragedy. And haunted by tragedy. Some were left after accidents or disappearances. Some were built on cliffs with histories darker than anyone could imagine. With histories darker than anyone could imagine. And some simply crumbled under the desert sun, leaving only their foundations and whispers behind. Under the desert sun, leaving only their foundations and whispers behind. Leaving only their foundations and whispers behind. And whispers behind. Behind. Visitors have reported strange phenomena. Footsteps echo along hallways where no one walks. Figures appear in rooms, disappearing when approached. Lanterns flicker despite no electricity. Doors open or slam on their own. Some have felt icy hands brush their shoulders. Others have heard whispers calling their names, carried by the desert wind. The air around these cliffside motels is heavy at night, thick with fog, desert mist, and the weight of history. Shadows twist along balconies, staircases creak under invisible weight. And some visitors swear they are followed by eyes that belong to no living person. Others feel the cliff itself shift beneath their feet, as though guiding them deeper into the haunted spaces. Before we walk these haunted cliffside motels together, my friend, I want to ask you something, and I hope you will answer in the comments. If you were standing alone on a motel balcony at midnight, and you heard your name whispered from an empty room, would you enter to see who is calling, or would you leave immediately, hoping the spirit lets you go? Take a deep breath. Steady your heartbeat. And let us explore the most haunted cliffside motels in Arizona. Black Rock Cliff Motel clings to the edge of a jagged coastline where stone drops sharply into dark, restless water. The road leading to the motel winds along the cliffside, narrow and uneven. Guardrails are rusted, and warning signs lean at odd angles. The building itself is low and elongated, designed so every room once faced the ocean. From a distance, it appears stable, but closer inspection reveals cracks in the walls and stains left by years of wind and salt. During daylight hours, Black Rock Cliff Motel feels empty rather than abandoned. Doors remain closed but intact. Curtains hang behind glass, faded by sun but still in place. The air smells of salt and dust, and the sound of waves far below rises steadily, echoing up the cliff face. The interior hallways are long and straight, lined with identical doors and dim overhead fixtures that no longer function. The floors are worn smooth in places where countless footsteps once passed. Even during the day, sound carries strangely here, traveling farther than expected before fading into silence. As evening approaches, the motel begins to feel less defined. Shadows stretch across the balconies, deepening the gaps between railings. The ocean darkens first, losing detail until it becomes a single shifting mass below. Wind picks up along the cliff edge, pressing against the building with steady force. Night settles heavily over Blackrock Cliff Motel. Moonlight outlines the structure against the sky, casting sharp contrasts between concrete and darkness. It is on these balconies that figures are most often reported. Visitors describe shapes standing near the railings, upright and still, facing the ocean. Their forms resemble people, but details remain indistinct. They appear as silhouettes against the faint light, defined more by absence than presence. These figures do not climb over the railings or move toward the edge. They stand at a measured distance, as if respecting an invisible boundary. Some remain motionless for long periods. Others shift slightly, turning their heads or adjusting their stance. When observers focus directly on them, the figures often fade into shadow, blending with the darkness cast by the building itself. Looking away and back again may reveal them on a different balcony, continuing their quiet vigil. Their attention seems fixed outward, toward the open water and distant horizon. The ocean continues its steady movement beneath them, unaffected. Inside the building, sound becomes the primary source of activity after dark. Visitors report footsteps echoing along the empty hallways, clear and deliberate. The footsteps travel from one end of the corridor to the other, passing closed doors and vacant rooms. The echo changes subtly as it moves, responding to corners and doorways. It feels directional, as though someone is walking with purpose. When listeners stop moving, the footsteps often continue for a moment, then pause as well. Starting to walk again brings them back, maintaining distance without ever closing it. Turning around reveals empty hallways stretching into darkness. The sound never overlaps with visible movement. No doors open. No shadows appear beneath doorframes. The footsteps exist independently, detached from any figure that can be seen. Historical records show Blackrock Cliff Motel was busiest during nighttime hours. Travelers arrived late, drawn by the promise of ocean views and solitude. Guests walked the balconies at night, listening to waves below, while staff paced the hallways on overnight shifts. The motel's design amplified sound intentionally. Long corridors allowed staff to hear movement easily. Balconies carried voices and footsteps outward, blending them with the ocean. These design choices shaped how the building felt and functioned. When tourism declined and maintenance costs rose, the motel was closed. Furniture was removed, utilities shut off, and doors locked. The structure was left intact, too remote to redevelop easily and too costly to demolish. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects these years of routine. The figures on the balconies echo guests who once stood there, looking out over the water. The footsteps repeat the paths walked by staff and travelers alike. Visitors often describe the experience as unsettling but restrained. The figures do not approach. The footsteps do not chase. Everything unfolds with distance and repetition, as if governed by patterns rather than intent. Sound behaves unpredictably within the motel at night. Wind outside can mask footsteps briefly, then allow them to return with greater clarity. The ocean below creates a constant backdrop, blurring the line between natural and interior noise. Attempts to document the phenomena rarely succeed. Photographs capture empty balconies and dark corridors. Video footage shows only shifting shadows cast by moonlight. Audio recordings pick up wind and waves, but footsteps often fade before registering clearly. Time perception can shift while inside Blackrock Cliff Motel at night. Long hallways seem to stretch farther than expected. Leaving the building often feels abrupt, like stepping out of a contained environment. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Figures appear less frequently on the balconies. Footsteps grow softer and more spaced out, eventually blending with the sound of wind and water. By the hours before dawn, the motel returns to near stillness. The hallways fall silent. Only the ocean continues its steady movement below. At sunrise, Blackrock Cliff Motel looks unchanged. No sign remains of figures or sound from the night before. Officials classify the motel as unsafe due to structural erosion and cliff instability. Access is discouraged, especially after dark. There are no warnings posted about sightings or sounds. Only notices about safety hazards are displayed. Those who have experienced the motel at night often carry lasting impressions. The image of figures standing silently on balconies. The echo of footsteps along empty hallways. The feeling that the building becomes active not with people, but with memory. Blackrock Cliff Motel does not feel hostile or inviting. It feels suspended between use and abandonment. By day, it rests quietly on the cliff. By night, it resumes subtle motion, shaped by wind, water, and routines that never fully faded. When morning returns, the motel settles again into silence, overlooking the ocean as it always has, holding its empty rooms and long corridors, waiting patiently for darkness to bring movement back once more. Widow's View Motel stands at the edge of a wide desert plain where the land stretches flat and open beneath an endless sky. The building is long and low, its concrete exterior bleached by years of sun and sand. A single road leads past it, rarely traveled, carrying dust and heat in slow, shimmering waves. The motel was built for travelers. Drivers crossing long distances once stopped here to rest, drawn by the promise of quiet rooms and an unobstructed view of the surrounding desert. Balconies run along the upper level, facing outward toward the horizon. From them, the land appears endless, offering nothing to interrupt the eye or the wind. The name Widow's View comes from a disappearance. Decades ago, a guest checked in alone and was never seen again. His belongings were found untouched in his room. His vehicle remained in the parking lot. Searches extended across miles of desert, but no trace was discovered. Over time, the story became inseparable from the motel itself. During the day, Widow's View Motel feels exposed and still. The sun presses down relentlessly. Shadows cling tightly to the underside of balconies and doorways. The air hums faintly with heat, and the wind moves sand in thin, whispering streams along the ground. The balconies dominate the structure. Their railings cast long, repeating shadows that stretch across the walls. Walkways run the length of the building, open to the air and fully exposed to sun and wind. Each room opens directly onto these corridors, creating a sense of constant visibility. As evening approaches, the desert begins to cool. The sky fades from bright blue to muted orange and gray. Heat releases slowly from the concrete, and the wind strengthens, carrying fine grains of sand that tap softly against walls and railings. It is after sunset that movement is first noticed. Figures appear in the shadows along the balconies, their shapes emerging gradually rather than arriving. Their forms are human in outline but indistinct, shaped by darkness rather than light. The figures do not enter the rooms. They remain on the walkways, turning at the ends and retracing their steps. They thin into the shadows beneath the overhangs, dissolving into empty space. Moments later, another shape may appear farther down the balcony, continuing the same motion as if uninterrupted. Witnesses frequently describe the movement as routine. The pacing feels purposeful, as though following habits established long ago. There is no sense of confusion or urgency. The figures seem absorbed in their path, focused on movement itself. Alongside the sightings come the sounds. Soft cries drift through the desert wind, carried low and distant across the open land. The sound is faint and uneven, rising and falling gently without forming words. It feels far away, as though traveling across great distance before reaching the motel. The cries move with the wind. At times they seem to come from beyond the motel, then circle closer, brushing past the balconies before fading again into the desert. Standing still makes the cries more noticeable. Movement often causes them to fade, as if attention itself plays a role in how the sound is perceived. The wind carries them unpredictably, sometimes clear, sometimes barely audible. Researchers studying desert acoustics offer explanations. Open landscapes allow sound to travel far at night. Cooling air can bend noise across long distances. Wind passing through structures can produce tones resembling voices. These factors explain how sound behaves, but not why it feels expressive. Visitors often report an emotional response. Not fear, but isolation. The cries feel reflective rather than alarming. As though echoing a sense of loss rather than distress. Combined with the pacing figures, the experience creates the impression of waiting rather than threat. The balconies seem central to the activity. They are the point of exposure, suspended between rooms and open desert. Years of guests standing there, looking out across the land, may have shaped the space itself. The repetition of pacing and watching could have left an imprint. Some believe the vanished guest remains part of the story. Not as a single presence, but as a moment that never resolved. His absence marked the motel in a way that routine maintenance could not erase. The figures may represent patterns interrupted rather than identities bound. Those who stay near Widow's View Motel after dark often describe heightened awareness. The vastness of the desert feels closer at night. Every sound carries meaning. Every shadow appears deeper. Time seems to slow, measured by footsteps along balconies and intervals between drifting cries. Despite the unsettling reputation, no recent harm has been reported. No one has been approached. No doors have opened on their own. The figures maintain distance. The cries remain far away. The motel allows observation, then returns to quiet. As the night deepens, activity gradually diminishes. The figures appear less frequently, fading more quickly into shadow. The cries grow softer, carried farther by cooling air. Eventually, only the sound of wind moving across sand remains. By early morning, Widow's View Motel returns to stillness. Sunlight reveals empty balconies and silent rooms. The desert stretches wide and unchanged. No trace of the night's movement or sound remains. Yet those who leave often glance back. The memory of pacing shadows and drifting cries lingers, difficult to dismiss. The experience feels less like a haunting and more like a continuation, as though the motel has not fully released its past. Widow's View Motel does not demand belief. It does not announce itself or seek attention. It stands quietly at the edge of the desert, shaped by distance, routine, and unanswered absence. When night falls and the wind carries sound differently, it reveals subtle movement and distant voices. Along the balconies, figures still seem to pace. Across the open land, soft cries still drift. And when daylight returns, the motel releases its hold. Standing silent once more. A solitary structure. facing the desert. Carrying echoes of waiting that refuse to fully fade. Ashen Peak Motel sits along a forgotten mountain road where the land rises sharply and the air thins without warning. The building stretches in a long, uneven line, its roof warped by years of sun and sudden storms. Paint has peeled from the walls in wide flakes, revealing older layers beneath, each one dulled by time. Windows stare outward, some intact, others cracked or missing entirely, all reflecting the sky in muted tones. By day, the motel looks abandoned but stable. Doors remain on their hinges. Room numbers still cling to the walls, though many are barely legible. A faded sign near the road leans at an angle, its lettering washed pale by wind and dust. The parking lot is empty, scattered with gravel and weeds pushing through old cracks. The temperature drops quickly, and shadows stretch across the lot and along the motel walkway. Wind moves in brief, uneven bursts, carrying the smell of dry earth and old asphalt. Sound feels distant here, as though the elevation pulls it away before it can settle. When night falls, the motel seems larger than it did before. Darkness fills the open spaces between rooms, and the walkway lights, long since broken, offer no guidance. The building feels hollow, as if every room is listening. The silence is not complete, but it is heavy, broken only by wind brushing against loose metal and the faint creak of aging wood. It is inside the vacant rooms that movement begins to appear. Figures stand just beyond doorways, partially obscured by darkness. They are upright and still, their outlines faint against the deeper shadow of the interiors. Some appear near windows, their shapes framed briefly by moonlight before fading back into the room. These figures do not step into the open. They remain inside, positioned near beds, walls, or doorframes, always just far enough back to avoid clear detail. When watched directly, they thin and soften, blending into darkness. When attention drifts, they return, occupying the same spaces with quiet consistency. Visitors walking along the motel walkway often notice the sensation of touch before fully understanding what they are seeing. Cold hands brush lightly against an arm. Fingers graze the wrist with brief, precise contact. The touch is unmistakable, cool enough to raise the skin, yet gentle and fleeting. The walkway remains clear. The figures stay inside the rooms, unchanged and silent. Yet the chill from the contact lingers, spreading faintly before fading. As visitors move past open doors and broken windows, the sensations repeat. Always brief. Always cold. The touches occur most often near rooms where figures appear most clearly, as if marking passage rather than interrupting it. Ashen Peak Motel once served travelers crossing the mountain pass. Drivers stopped here to rest before continuing along steep roads and narrow curves. Rooms filled at night with quiet routines, doors opening and closing, brief conversations carried on tired voices. Over time, traffic slowed. Routes changed. The motel closed, leaving its rooms to the elements. Some believe the figures reflect those years of use. Shapes lingering where people once paused between journeys. Touches echoing the close quarters of narrow walkways and shared walls. The building seems to remember movement even in absence. As night deepens, the figures become more numerous. They appear in multiple rooms at once, never interacting, never crossing into the open air. Their presence feels distributed, balanced, as though each vacant space holds its own quiet occupant. The motel no longer feels empty, only unoccupied by the living. The sensation of cold hands becomes slightly more frequent near the center of the building. A brush against the forearm. A light touch at the shoulder. The contact remains careful, never gripping, never pulling. The touches do not escalate. Everything occurs within quiet limits, restrained and measured. The touches fade. The figures seem to retreat deeper into the rooms, becoming harder to distinguish from shadow. The motel grows still, balanced, waiting. When movement resumes, the activity returns. Figures reappear near doorways. Cold brushes pass once more along exposed skin. The building feels attentive rather than reactive, acknowledging presence without interference. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited results. Photographs show empty rooms and dark interiors. Video footage captures shifting light and shadow that resist clear interpretation. Audio recordings reveal only wind and the distant sounds of the mountain at night. Environmental explanations suggest temperature differences, isolation, and low light heighten perception. These explanations account for parts of the experience, but not the consistency or precision of the reported touches. As the night reaches its quietest hours, activity begins to lessen. Figures appear less often, dissolving more quickly into darkness. The sensation of cold hands stops without notice. The motel settles into deep stillness, holding only shadow and wind. By early morning, Ashen Peak Motel appears unchanged. Sunlight reveals faded paint, empty rooms, and a silent parking lot. The air warms slightly. No figures remain. No sensation follows movement. Visitors leaving at dawn often pause at the edge of the lot, looking back at the long row of doors and windows. In daylight, the motel seems peaceful and abandoned, offering no hint of what the night contained. Yet those who walked its length after dark remember clearly. Shapes standing silently in vacant rooms. Cold hands brushing past in still air. The feeling of being acknowledged by a place built for brief stays and passing lives. Ashen Peak Motel remains where it has always been, weathered by sun, wind, and storms. By day, it is quiet and forgotten. By night, it becomes something else. When darkness settles over the mountain road and the wind moves softly along the walkway, figures sometimes return to the vacant rooms. Cold hands brush lightly against passing arms. And for a short while, the motel remembers the travelers who once filled its rooms. Before silence returns and the road waits again. Hollow Canyon Motel clings to the edge of a vast chasm where stone drops away into darkness and wind moves far below. The building was constructed decades ago to serve travelers crossing the high desert, its long corridors aligned to offer sweeping views of the canyon. From a distance, the motel looks sturdy and deliberate, concrete and steel anchored to rock. Up close, it feels suspended, as if held in place by habit rather than structure. By day, the canyon draws the eye. Light pours into the depths, revealing layered stone and narrow ledges where shadows gather even at noon. The motel corridors run parallel to the edge, separated from the drop by waist-high railings. Doors line the walls at regular intervals, each one identical, each one opening onto the same long walkway. As afternoon fades, the atmosphere begins to change. Wind rises from below, cool and steady, brushing the underside of the walkways. The canyon darkens unevenly, swallowing light in pockets that creep upward. Inside the motel, the air grows still. The lobby empties early, and the quiet stretches longer than expected. After sunset, shadows begin to move. They glide silently along the corridors, slipping past doors and pooling near corners before continuing onward. These shadows do not match any passing figure. They stretch and narrow independent of light, sliding smoothly as though carried by an unseen current. Watching them directly causes them to thin and fade. Looking away allows them to continue their quiet passage. Visitors often notice the movement indirectly. A shifting outline reflected faintly in a window. Turning reveals empty space and steady railings, yet the sense of motion remains. Traveling the length of the corridor without sound. Lanterns flicker without source. They hang at regular intervals along the walkways, mounted where modern fixtures once stood. No bulbs are visible. Yet soft light pulses within the glass, brightening and dimming in slow, irregular rhythms. The flicker casts moving patterns along the walls and floor, causing shadows to stretch and retract in gentle waves. The lantern light never fully illuminates the corridor. It creates islands of visibility separated by darker stretches, encouraging slow movement from one pool of light to the next. Standing still beneath a lantern often brings a sense of calm, while stepping into the darker sections increases awareness of the canyon beyond the railing. The canyon makes itself known at night. Sound rises from below in soft layers, wind brushing stone, distant echoes that feel closer than they should. The depth becomes harder to judge. Looking down reveals darkness swallowing detail, making the drop feel endless. Some visitors report the sensation that the canyon is watching, not with intent, but with attention, aware of every footstep above. Inside the rooms, the experience continues. Doors close with a muted thud, and silence settles quickly. Windows overlook the canyon, their glass reflecting the flickering lantern light from outside. Shadows pass across walls without casting source. At times, faint movement appears in the reflection, then slips away when looked at directly. Historical records show Hollow Canyon Motel was once busy. Built during a surge of desert travel, it provided rest for long drives and shelter from sudden storms. Over time, routes changed. The motel remained open longer than expected, sustained by habit and familiarity rather than demand. Eventually, rooms stood empty more often than not, and maintenance became minimal. According to local belief, the motel adapted rather than closed. The canyon below has always been active, carrying sound and air upward. Some believe the building learned to echo that movement, allowing shadows and light to drift as the canyon does. The lanterns reflect an older need for guidance along the corridors, while the shadows mark paths taken too many times to fade. Visitors who stay overnight often report unusual perceptions. Time stretches. Hallways feel longer after midnight. Doors seem farther apart than earlier in the evening. The flicker of lanterns becomes more noticeable, their rhythm syncing subtly with breathing or footsteps. Some feel the urge to walk the corridors without destination, drawn by the alternating light and shadow. One visitor described standing at the railing near the far end of the motel, watching shadows glide past behind him in the window reflection. Lanterns flickered softly overhead. The canyon below exhaled a steady wind. He felt no fear, only the sense of being part of a larger, ongoing motion. Another account tells of a guest who woke to find lantern light pulsing outside the room, brighter than before. Shadows moved along the corridor in slow procession. When the guest stepped outside, the movement continued ahead, never turning back, guiding the eye toward the canyon edge without drawing closer. The lanterns never go dark completely. Despite its unsettling qualities, Hollow Canyon Motel does not feel hostile. Nothing blocks exits. Nothing rushes or pursues. The shadows never touch, and the lanterns never go dark completely. The tension comes from awareness rather than threat. Everything unfolds with patience, allowing visitors to observe without pressure. The shadows never touch, and the lanterns never go dark completely. As the night deepens, activity often becomes subtler. Shadows thin and blend with darkness. Lantern flicker slows, settling into a gentler pulse. Wind rises steadily from the canyon, smoothing sound into a constant presence. The corridors feel suspended between movement and stillness, held in balance. By dawn, the motel releases its hold. Lanterns dim and stabilize, appearing inert once more. Shadows return to fixed shapes cast by railings and doorframes. The canyon reveals its layered stone as light returns, depth becoming measurable again. Morning air brings clarity and distance. Visitors arriving during daylight often sense nothing unusual. The corridors appear ordinary. The lanterns are unlit. Shadows remain where they should. The canyon looks vast but inert. Only those who stayed through the night remember the silent movement, the source-less light, and the feeling of being suspended above something attentive. Hollow Canyon Motel exists at the boundary between structure and void. Built over a deep canyon, it reflects the movement below in quiet ways. Shadows glide along corridors without sound. Lanterns flicker without visible cause. The building does not demand belief or fear. It simply mirrors the canyon beneath it, holding light and shadow in slow motion. Waiting for night to return so the quiet movement can begin again. Bloodstone Cliff Motel stands along a steep coastal road where the land drops sharply into open water. The location was once considered scenic rather than dangerous. Travelers stopped here for rest and views, unaware of how unforgiving the cliff could be. Over time, multiple accidents occurred along the surrounding roads and walkways. Some involved vehicles losing control. Others involved falls during poor visibility or heavy weather. Each incident added to the motel's reputation, until business slowed and the property was eventually closed. During daylight hours, Bloodstone Cliff Motel feels still and cautious. The ocean below moves steadily, sending sound upward in a constant rhythm. The balconies are intact but worn, their railings rusted and pitted. Windows reflect sky and water, revealing nothing of the rooms behind them. Inside, the corridors are long and uniform. Identical doors line the walls, each leading to an empty room preserved in silence. Carpet is faded and thin in places where foot traffic was once constant. The air carries a faint scent of dust and salt, as though the building never fully dried after years of coastal weather. As evening approaches, the motel begins to feel less stable. Shadows stretch across balconies, narrowing the walking space. The ocean darkens first, losing texture until it becomes a single moving mass below. Wind presses against the structure, carrying sound along the corridors and around corners. Night arrives quietly but completely. Moonlight outlines the building against the cliff, leaving sharp contrasts between concrete and darkness. The balconies appear suspended over nothing, their edges barely visible. The road below fades from sight, and the motel feels isolated from the world around it. It is within the rooms that figures are most often reported. Visitors describe shapes rising from darkness inside abandoned rooms. These figures appear upright and human in outline, but lack clear detail. The figures appear upright and human in outline, but lack clear detail. Their forms seem to assemble gradually, as if lifting from the space itself. Their forms seem to assemble gradually, as if lifting from the space itself. They do not step forward or exit the rooms. They do not step forward or exit the rooms. Instead, they remain near the thresholds, partially visible. Instead, they remain near the thresholds, partially visible. Some linger for several moments before fading back into shadow. Some linger for several moments before fading back into shadow. Others remain still, facing outward toward the balconies. When observers focus directly on them, the figures often dissolve into darkness, leaving the room appearing empty once more. Looking away and back again may reveal them in a different doorway, repeating the same slow emergence. Alongside these appearances, visitors report hearing whispers. The sound is soft and close, forming near the listener rather than echoing down the hall. Instead, it feels contained, directed. The whispers call names. Clear and unmistakable, spoken calmly and without urgency. Visitors report hearing their own names, even when alone and having shared no personal information. The voice carries no emotion, neither comforting nor threatening. The whispers are never loud. They remain just above silence, requiring attention to hear. Ignoring them often causes the sound to fade gradually. Responding or acknowledging the sound may cause it to repeat, closer than before. Those who answer the whispers often report an intensification of activity. Figures appear more frequently. The corridors feel narrower. Sound carries farther. For this reason, experienced visitors advise remaining silent and leaving once whispers begin. Historical accounts suggest the accidents near Bloodstone Cliff Motel often involved confusion and poor visibility. Fog, wind, and darkness played significant roles. Witnesses described calling out names during searches or rescue attempts, voices carried by wind and cliff walls. Some believe the whispers echo these moments, repeating fragments of sound tied to urgency and recognition. Others suggest the building itself has absorbed these voices, releasing them under specific conditions when the environment grows still enough. Sound behaves unpredictably inside the motel at night. Footsteps are rare, but the building responds to movement with subtle creaks and distant echoes. A door frame may pop softly. A railing may vibrate briefly in the wind. These sounds blend with the whispers, creating uncertainty about their source. Visitors often describe a sense of being recognized rather than watched. The figures rising from rooms appear aware of the presence around them, though they never approach directly. Attempts to document the phenomena rarely succeed. Photographs show empty corridors and dark rooms. Video footage captures shifting shadows and light from outside. Audio recordings pick up wind and ocean, but whispers often fail to register clearly. Time perception can shift while inside Bloodstone Cliff Motel at night. Corridors seem longer than expected. Silence stretches between sounds. Leaving the building often feels abrupt, as though stepping out of a contained environment. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Figures appear less often and fade more quickly. Whispers grow softer and less frequent, eventually blending into the sound of wind moving past the structure. By the hours before dawn, the motel returns to near stillness. The rooms appear empty. The balconies are quiet. Only the ocean continues its steady movement below the cliff. At sunrise, Bloodstone Cliff Motel looks unchanged. Daylight reveals cracked concrete, peeling paint, and empty rooms. No sign remains of figures or sound from the night before. Authorities classify the motel as unsafe due to structural wear and the history of accidents along the cliff. There are no official warnings about whispers or sightings, only notices regarding safety hazards. Access is discouraged, especially after dark. Those who have experienced the motel at night often carry lasting impressions. The image of figures rising from darkened rooms. The quiet clarity of hearing their own names spoken in empty corridors. The feeling that the building remembers voices and knows how to use them. Bloodstone Cliff Motel does not feel hostile or inviting. It feels attentive, shaped by accident, repetition, and memory. By day, it rests silently against the cliff. By night, it releases fragments of sound and motion that never fully left. When morning returns, the motel settles again into stillness, overlooking the ocean as it always has. Holding its empty rooms and long corridors. Waiting for darkness to return and allow those fragments to surface once more. Ironclad Motel sits beside a long, quiet highway where traffic thins and the landscape opens into wide stretches of scrub and stone. The building is rectangular and heavy, reinforced with iron railings, staircases, and balcony supports that give it a rigid, industrial appearance. Time has dulled the metal to a dark gray, and rust traces run downward where rain has followed the same paths for decades. The motel was designed to last. Its iron staircases rise along the outer walls, bolted firmly into concrete. Balconies run the length of each floor, supported by thick beams that rarely flex, even in strong wind. From a distance, the structure feels solid and unmoving, as if it resists both weather and age through sheer weight. During the day, Ironclad Motel appears quiet but intact. Sunlight reflects faintly off metal railings. Shadows fall sharply beneath the balconies, forming clean, repeating lines along the walls. The air carries the smell of dust and warm iron. Every sound feels contained, bouncing briefly before disappearing. The staircases creak even without use. As temperature shifts, the metal expands and contracts, producing low groans and subtle clicks. A railing may respond with a slow complaint. A step may settle slightly, releasing a muted echo that travels upward through the structure. The heat releases from the concrete. The metal cools slowly, holding on to warmth longer than the surrounding air. Shadows deepen along the walkways, and the open corridors feel longer and more enclosed. It is after nightfall that movement is noticed. Figures appear along the balconies, pacing silently near the railings. Their forms are human in outline but indistinct, shaped by shadow rather than light. They move steadily, turning at the ends of the walkways and retracing their steps without pause. The figures do not enter rooms. They remain on the platforms, keeping to the open corridors. Their pacing is deliberate and even, suggesting routine rather than restlessness. They never rush and never stop abruptly. When watched directly, the figures often fade. They thin into the darkness beneath overhangs or dissolve into the shadowed sections of the walkway. Moments later, another shape may appear farther down the balcony, continuing the same slow pattern as if uninterrupted. Witnesses frequently describe the silence. The metal beneath them does not creak or shift, as though their weight does not register in the usual way. Alongside the sightings comes another sensation. Visitors walking through the motel often hear footsteps echoing behind them. The sound is clear and measured, matching the rhythm of a person walking at a comfortable pace. The corridor remains empty. The stairwell is still. Yet the footsteps continue for several seconds, adjusting speed when the visitor slows, then stopping abruptly when movement stops. These sounds differ from ordinary echoes. They follow turns. They descend staircases. They respond to changes in pace. The sound behaves as though attached to movement rather than environment. Researchers studying metal structures point to natural explanations. Iron staircases amplify vibration. Air movement through open corridors can carry sound unexpectedly. Cooling metal can shift and settle rhythmically. These factors explain isolated noises, but not the persistent sensation of being followed. Visitors often report a heightened sense of awareness. The open design of the motel leaves few places to hide. Every shadow feels intentional. Every sound feels closer. The footsteps behind them create a sense of proximity that lingers even when the corridor is empty. Despite the unsettling experience, fear is uncommon. Most describe alertness rather than panic. The figures do not approach. The footsteps do not chase. The motel feels active, not aggressive, as though movement continues without intent to engage. Some believe the iron itself holds memory. Years of repeated foot traffic, luggage rolling across platforms, and steady movement up and down staircases may have impressed patterns into the structure. Under certain conditions, these patterns may resurface as sound and motion. Others believe the design plays a role. Open corridors and exposed staircases create constant awareness of movement. Those who remain at Ironclad Motel late into the night often describe changes in perception. Time feels slower. Sounds feel deliberate. The footsteps behind them seem closer than expected, yet never resolve into a visible presence. The pacing figures feel distant, yet consistent. As the night deepens, activity gradually diminishes. The figures appear less frequently, fading more quickly into shadow. The footsteps grow softer and less persistent, eventually blending into the low creaks of cooling metal. By early morning, the motel returns to stillness. Sunlight reveals empty balconies and silent staircases. The structure appears unchanged. Yet those who leave often glance back. The memory of pacing figures and echoing footsteps lingers, difficult to dismiss. The experience feels less like an encounter and more like a continuation, as though the motel never fully stops moving. Ironclad Motel does not announce itself. It does not warn or threaten. It stands beside the highway, shaped by iron, repetition, and time. Along the balconies, figures still seem to pace in silence. Along the corridors, footsteps still follow just behind. And when daylight returns, the motel releases its hold, standing quiet once more, a reinforced structure that continues to carry the memory of motion within its metal frame, patiently repeating what wants to find it. Mistvale Motel sits alone along a long stretch of desert highway where the land flattens and the horizon feels endlessly distant. The desert around it appears empty, broken only by low scrub and scattered stones. Wind moves freely here, carrying grit across cracked pavement and whispering softly through open doorways. Even in daylight, the motel feels removed from time, as though it was left behind by a world that kept moving. Heat drains quickly from the ground, and the air grows cool and still. The sky darkens into deep blue, then black, revealing stars sharp enough to feel close. Fog drifts low across the desert floor, rolling in slow sheets from unseen low ground. It moves quietly, hugging the earth before lifting and spreading outward. When it reaches Mistvale Motel, it flows around the foundation and rises along the walls, climbing toward the balconies like a slow tide. Sound fades as the fog thickens. The open land feels smaller, enclosed. Footsteps on the concrete walkway seem muted, absorbed by moisture and air. The motel, once stark against the desert, becomes softened and indistinct, its edges blurred by drifting white. Figures begin to appear along the balconies. At first, they resemble shadows gathered near the railings, darker shapes against the pale fog. With time, they grow clearer, forming upright silhouettes that stand motionless or move slowly along the upper walkways. Their outlines remain human in shape but lack detail, as if the fog refuses to allow full clarity. These figures do not rush or gesture. They glide gently, passing doorways and stairwells without sound. Visitors watching from below often feel a quiet unease rather than fear. The figures feel present, but not aggressive. They do not acknowledge attention. They remain absorbed in their slow movement, as though following routines remembered rather than chosen. Then, from within the rooms, another detail emerges. They do not rush or gesture. They glide gently, passing doorways and stairwells without sound. Pale eyes begin to glow softly in the darkness behind windows and open doors. The light is faint and steady, never bright enough to illuminate the room itself. It appears at a familiar height, positioned where faces would be if someone stood just inside. They remain fixed for several seconds before dimming and disappearing, only to reappear moments later in a different room. Sometimes they appear in pairs. Sometimes alone. Always watching. Approaching the rooms reveals nothing inside. The interiors remain empty, stripped of furniture and covered in dust. Yet the sensation of being observed lingers, heavy and undeniable. Mistvale Motel once served drivers crossing the desert at night, when visibility was low and rest was necessary. Families stopped here. Truckers parked beneath the balconies. Lights glowed in windows while engines cooled outside. For decades, it was a place of brief shelter before the road continued. As routes changed and traffic slowed, the motel closed. Doors were left unlocked. Rooms emptied. The desert reclaimed the silence. Some believe the figures reflect that history. Shapes lingering where travelers once walked the balconies. Eyes glowing where people once watched the night from their rooms. The fog seems to carry these impressions forward, reshaping them into quiet presence. As the night deepens, the activity grows more pronounced. Figures appear along both levels of the motel, gliding past stairwells and railings. The pale eyes glow more frequently now, scattered throughout the building in no obvious pattern. The fog thickens, rising to balcony height and slipping through open doors and broken windows. Despite the unsettling scene, panic rarely sets in. The figures pause or thin into the fog. The glowing eyes dim slightly, as if responding to stillness. The desert feels quiet again, balanced and waiting. When movement resumes, the activity returns. Figures glide once more along the balconies. Pale eyes glow again in empty rooms. The fog shifts and curls, following motion without sound. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced little clarity. Photographs capture fog-filled walkways and dark windows. Video footage shows drifting mist and vague shapes that resist focus. Audio recordings reveal only distant wind and the faint hum of night insects. Environmental explanations suggest temperature shifts and rare desert fog create unusual visual effects. Low light and isolation may heighten perception. These explanations account for parts of the experience, but not its consistency or placement. As the night reaches its quietest hours, the activity begins to fade. Figures grow fewer, dissolving more quickly into fog. The glowing eyes appear less often, dimming until they vanish completely. The fog loosens its hold on the building, sinking slowly back toward the ground. By early morning, Mistvale Motel appears unchanged. The fog thins into scattered wisps that drift away across the desert. No figures remain. No eyes glow behind the glass. Visitors leaving at dawn often pause on the highway, looking back as the motel stands alone against the rising light. In daylight, it seems abandoned and ordinary, offering no hint of what the night contained. Yet those who witnessed the fog remember clearly. Figures gliding along the balconies. Pale eyes glowing softly in empty rooms. The feeling of being watched in a place built for rest and passing lives. Mistvale Motel remains where it has always been, exposed to sun, wind, and time. By day, it is quiet and forgotten. By night, when fog drifts across the desert and the stars dim behind clouded air, the motel sometimes remembers. And for a brief time, the desert road feels less empty. Before the fog fades, the lights disappear. And silence settles back over the land. Shadow Peak Motel rests on the highest cliff in the region, anchored to stone where the land drops away into open air. From the road below, the building appears balanced rather than secured, its long structure tracing the edge of the precipice with deliberate precision. Clouds often drift past the upper floors, blurring the line between ground and sky. Even before arriving, visitors feel the altitude in the air. The motel was built decades ago to serve travelers drawn by the view. Long exterior corridors face the cliff, protected by metal railings that offer uninterrupted sightlines across valleys and distant peaks. During the day, the scenery is breathtaking. Wind moves steadily along the edge, carrying the scent of stone and pine. Sound travels far here, voices echoing outward before dissolving into space. As evening approaches, Shadow Peak Motel changes. The sky darkens faster at this elevation. Shadows stretch across the walkways, lengthening between doors and railings. Wind softens, losing its sharp edge and becoming a steady presence rather than a force. The cliff below absorbs light, turning into a vast, indistinct depth that feels closer than it should. It is at dusk that figures are first reported. They appear pacing the railing along the outer corridors, moving slowly back and forth near the edge. At first glance, they resemble other guests enjoying the view, hands resting on the metal bars, posture relaxed. Only after watching for a moment does something feel wrong. Their pace never changes. Their movement is too consistent, too measured. The figures do not speak. They do not acknowledge one another. They do not turn when approached. Their outlines are pale against the darkening sky, softened by drifting cloud and low light. When visitors look directly at them, the figures seem less defined, as if the eyes struggle to focus. When attention drifts away, they appear more clearly once again. Minutes later, they may reappear farther down the corridor, resuming their steady pacing as if uninterrupted. As night settles fully, the sensation of presence grows stronger. Visitors walking the corridors often feel something behind them, close enough to notice without seeing. The awareness is subtle at first, like the feeling of someone following just out of view. Turning reveals empty walkways and closed doors, yet the sensation persists, matching each step taken. The presence does not feel threatening. There is no pressure or urgency. It feels observant, attentive, as though sharing the path rather than pursuing. Some describe it as a quiet companion, others as an unseen witness moving just beyond the edge of perception. Lantern-style lights mounted along the corridors glow softly after dark. Their illumination is uneven, creating alternating stretches of brightness and shadow. The light reflects off the metal railing and the windows of the rooms, casting faint duplicates of movement that do not always align with reality. Shadows shift subtly, sometimes appearing to move in opposite directions than expected. The cliff below seems to respond to the activity above. Wind rises and falls in slow waves, carrying distant sounds upward that feel closer than they should. The depth becomes difficult to judge, especially at night, when darkness swallows all reference points. Standing near the railing creates a heightened awareness of balance and space, as if the cliff is gently reminding visitors of its presence. Inside the rooms, the atmosphere remains unsettled. Windows overlook the drop, and reflections from corridor lights drift across the glass. At times, movement appears in the reflection that does not match anything outside the door. Curtains stir without breeze. The sense of presence follows inside, lingering near doorways and along walls before fading again. Historical records show Shadow Peak Motel was once a popular destination. Built during a period when scenic travel was prized. It offered unmatched views and quiet isolation. Over time, routes changed and visitor numbers declined. The motel remained open longer than expected, sustained by nostalgia and the draw of the cliff itself. Eventually, many rooms stood empty, and the building settled into a quieter rhythm. Local belief suggests the motel never fully emptied. According to long-held stories, the figures pacing the railing reflect habits formed over years of repeated movement. Guests who walked the corridors at sunset. Travelers who paused at the edge, drawn by the view. The presence felt behind visitors is said to be memory itself, following familiar paths without intention. Visitors who stay late into the night often report changes in perception. Corridors feel longer after midnight. Distances between doors seem subtly altered. The railing feels closer, the cliff more immediate. The pacing figures appear more frequently, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, always maintaining their steady rhythm. One visitor described walking the length of the corridor as clouds drifted past at eye level. A figure paced the railing ahead, pale against the sky. Behind him, the sensation of presence matched his steps exactly. When he stopped, it stopped. When he turned, nothing was there. The experience felt calm, yet deeply unsettling. Another account tells of a guest who watched two figures pacing opposite ends of the corridor. Neither acknowledged the other. As the guest approached, both figures faded into the night, leaving the railing empty. The presence behind the guest lingered until he returned to his room, then vanished abruptly. Despite its unsettling reputation, Shadow Peak Motel does not feel hostile. Nothing blocks movement. Nothing forces visitors toward the edge. The figures do not reach out, and the presence does not press closer. Everything unfolds slowly and predictably, allowing time to observe and choose awareness over fear. As night deepens, activity often lessens. Figures appear less frequently, their pacing slowing before fading entirely. The presence grows fainter, retreating into the background. Wind smooths out, becoming a constant hush along the cliff face. The motel feels suspended between motion and stillness. By dawn, the atmosphere shifts once more. Morning light reveals the full depth of the valley below, restoring perspective and distance. The corridors appear ordinary. No figures pace the railing. The sense of presence is gone. Guests who step outside early often feel relief mixed with quiet disbelief. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. Shadow Peak Motel looks peaceful, even inviting, its location dramatic but stable. Only those who walk the corridors at night remember the pacing figures, the unseen companion following just behind, and the way the cliffs seem to listen. Shadow Peak Motel exists where height amplifies awareness. Built on the highest cliff in the region, it reflects the vast space around it. Figures appear pacing the railing, repeating familiar paths. A presence follows quietly, sharing each step without demand. The motel does not threaten. It does not call out. It simply remains. Balanced at the edge of stone and sky. Holding the memory of movement. Until night falls again. And the quiet pacing resumes. Deadman's View Motel. Sits high above a winding road. Positioned to overlook a wide stretch of land. That disappears into haze. The building was constructed for travelers seeking rest and scenery. But time has stripped it of both comfort and purpose. By day, the motel appears empty and motionless. Its windows dark. Its doors closed. Its long exterior corridors exposed to wind and sun. The structure is simple and repetitive. 2 levels of rooms face outward, connected by narrow hallways and staircases at either end. Railings line the walkways, chipped and faded, while old light fixtures hang overhead, long disconnected from power. From a distance, the motel looks intact, but closer inspection reveals were shaped by years of abandonment. During daylight hours, the rooms remain silent. Doors show numbers worn nearly smooth by countless hands. Inside, the spaces are bare, stripped of furniture and fixtures. Leaving only outlines on walls and floors where objects once stood. Sound travels easily here, yet nothing moves to create it. The view beyond the motel is expansive. Hills and open land stretch outward, creating a sense of height and exposure. Wind moves freely along the corridors, carrying faint echoes that vanish quickly. Visitors often describe the place as empty but watchful, as if the building is aware of every step taken within it. As evening approaches, the mood begins to shift. Shadows lengthen along the hallways, filling doorways and corners. The view beyond the railings darkens first, losing detail until the land below becomes a single flat shape. The motel feels more isolated, suspended above darkness. Night arrives quietly at Deadman's View Motel. Moonlight outlines the railings and edges of the walkways, while the rest of the structure dissolves into shadow. The corridors stretch longer in the dim light, their repetition becoming disorienting. Silence deepens, broken only by wind brushing against the building. It is within these hallways that figures are most often reported. Visitors describe shapes rising slowly along the corridors, emerging near doorways or from the shadows between rooms. The figures appear upright and human in outline, but lack defining features. They do not walk in the usual sense. Instead, They seem to assemble into place, becoming visible where there was nothing moments before. Others drift slowly forward, following the length of the walkway with measured pace. When observers focus directly on them, the figures often fade, blending back into shadow or dissolving entirely. Looking away and back again may reveal them farther down the hall, continuing as if uninterrupted. The figures do not approach visitors directly. Sound accompanies these appearances in subtle ways. Visitors report hearing lanterns swinging overhead, the soft clink of metal against metal, followed by a gentle creak. The sound moves slowly, as if carried by motion, though no lanterns are visible. Their presence feels restrained, as though limited by invisible boundaries set by the building itself. Occasionally, a faint glow appears near old fixtures, swaying slightly before dimming again. The light is weak and unstable, illuminating only a small patch of corridor before disappearing. When examined closely, no source can be found. Footsteps are also reported, soft but distinct. The sound travels from one end of the corridor to the other, passing closed doors and empty rooms. When a listener stops moving, the footsteps often continue briefly, then pause as well. Starting to walk again brings them back, maintaining distance without closing in. Turning around reveals an empty hallway stretching into darkness. The echoes exist independently, shaped by the structure and the night. No figures appear to match the sound. The footsteps never overlap with visible movement. No shadows shift beneath doors. The echoes exist independently, shaped by the structure and the night. No figures appear to match the sound. Historical records suggest Deadman's View Motel was busiest during late evening and overnight hours. Travelers arrived after long drives, lanterns and exterior lights guiding them to rooms. Staff walked the corridors regularly, checking doors and assisting guests. Over time, the road fell out of favor. The motel was eventually closed, its doors locked and later left unsecured. Furniture was removed, but the building itself remained, too remote to repurpose easily. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects these years of routine. The figures in the hallways echo guests and staff moving through identical spaces. The lantern sounds repeat guidance once provided in darkness. The footsteps follow paths worn into concrete by repetition. Visitors often describe the experience as unsettling but controlled. The figures do not rush. The sounds do not escalate. Everything unfolds with distance and repetition, as if governed by patterns rather than intent. As if governed by patterns rather than intent. Sound behaves unpredictably within the motel at night. Wind can mask footsteps, then allow them to return suddenly. Echoes linger longer than expected. Direction becomes difficult to judge, adding to the sense of disorientation. Attempts to document the phenomena rarely succeed. Photographs show empty corridors and dark doorways. Video footage captures only shifting shadows cast by moonlight. Audio recordings pick up wind and distant noise, but lantern sounds and footsteps often fade before registering clearly. Time perception can shift while inside Deadman's View Motel at night. Corridors seem longer. Silence stretches between sounds. Minutes pass unnoticed, then feel extended. Minutes pass unnoticed, then feel extended. Leaving the building often feels abrupt, like stepping out of a contained environment. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Figures appear less often and fade more quickly. Lantern sounds become faint and sporadic. Footsteps soften until they blend with the sound of wind. The corridors lie empty. The rooms remain silent. The view beyond the railings begins to regain shape as light slowly returns. At sunrise, Deadman's View Motel looks unchanged. Daylight reveals peeling paint, cracked concrete, and long rows of closed doors. Authorities classify the motel as unsafe due to age and exposure, discouraging entry, especially after dark. Those who have experienced the motel at night often carry lasting impressions. The image of figures rising along empty hallways. The sound of lanterns swinging where none hang. The echo of footsteps following just out of sight. Dead Man's View Motel does not feel hostile or welcoming. By day, it stands abandoned and silent. By night, it resumes quiet motion, repeating routines shaped long ago. When morning returns, the building settles again into stillness. Overlooking the land as it always has, holding its empty rooms and endless corridors. Waiting patiently for darkness to bring movement back once more. Hollow Oak Cliff Motel clings to the edge of a rocky overlook where land drops sharply into a wide, mist-filled valley below. The oaks are the first thing visitors notice. Their trunks are thick and weathered, bark split by age and exposure. Branches stretch over the road and footpaths, forming a canopy that filters light into shifting patterns. Even in calm weather, the leaves move slowly, brushing together with a soft, persistent sound that follows anyone walking beneath them. The motel was built decades ago to offer rest and views. Travelers once stopped here to look out across the valley, drawn by the quiet and the dramatic drop beyond the railings. Balconies face outward toward the cliff, while rooms line a single corridor that runs the length of the structure. Over time, visits became less frequent, and the motel slipped gradually into disuse. During the day, Hollow Oak Cliff Motel feels isolated but peaceful. Sunlight reflects off windows and railings. The valley stretches wide below, filled with drifting fog that rises and thins as the hours pass. Wind moves steadily along the cliff, carrying the scent of stone, leaves, and distant water. Oak roots push through cracks in the pavement, lifting stones unevenly. Shadows from the branches fall across the walkway in irregular shapes, stretching and shifting even when the sun appears steady. The movement feels subtle but constant, never fully still. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to change. Light fades first beneath the trees, while the sky above the valley remains faintly bright. The oaks darken into towering silhouettes. Shadows gather among the branches, deepening and twisting in ways that seem disconnected from the angle of the light. Visitors often notice the shadows behaving strangely. A dark shape may slide along a branch, then vanish. When watched closely, the shadows often settle back into ordinary darkness, blending with bark and leaves. Fog rises from the valley as night falls. It drifts upward along the cliff face, curling around the lower levels of the motel and spilling onto the balconies. The air cools quickly, and sound begins to carry differently, softened by moisture and distance. It is after nightfall that the most unsettling reports begin. From within the motel, faint cries echo through the empty rooms. The sound is low and distant, never sharp or sudden. It seems to come from rooms that are unoccupied, traveling down the corridor before fading into silence. The cries are not constant. They arrive sporadically, separated by long stretches of quiet. Sometimes they feel closer, as if coming from the room just beyond the wall. Other times they seem to drift in from farther down the corridor, carried by the movement of air through open spaces. The motel feels responsive, as though sound shifts based on attention. Outside, the shadows among the oaks become more active. They twist and stretch along the branches, sliding from trunk to trunk. The movement feels slow and deliberate, not tied directly to wind or light. The trees appear alive with layered darkness, shapes forming and dissolving without clear source. Despite the unsettling environment, fear is not the dominant response. Most visitors describe unease mixed with curiosity. The cries do not escalate. The shadows do not rush or surround. The experience feels restrained, as though the place reveals only fragments rather than full displays. Researchers suggest natural explanations. Wind passing through empty rooms can create tonal sounds. Fog can bend and carry noise across open spaces. Shadows may shift due to subtle changes in light and movement within the canopy. The cries are reported under similar conditions. The shadows behave most actively near the oldest oaks. The experiences repeat regardless of season or weather. Patterns emerge that feel tied to the place rather than circumstance. Some believe the motel retains impressions of past occupants. Years of guests resting, waking, and gazing out over the cliff may have shaped how sound and space interact. Others believe the cliff itself plays a role. Sound travels upward along rock faces in unusual ways. Fog amplifies and redirects noise. The motel, positioned between trees and open air, may simply collect and return what the environment produces. Those who stay overnight often describe vivid dreams. Dreams of standing at the edge of the cliff. Of hearing voices without seeing faces. Of moving through corridors that stretch longer than expected. Upon waking, many feel contemplative rather than alarmed. The cries grow softer and less frequent, dissolving into the sound of wind moving through leaves. The shadows among the oaks settle into stillness, merging fully with the darkness. By early morning, Hollow Oak Cliff Motel returns to quiet. Fog thins and drifts back into the valley. Sunlight reaches the paths once more. The oaks stand motionless. The rooms remain empty and silent. Yet those who leave often glance back. The memory of twisting shadows and distant cries lingers, difficult to dismiss. The experience feels less like an encounter and more like a reminder, as though the place holds on to moments long after people move on. Hollow Oak Cliff Motel does not demand belief. It stands at the edge of land and air, shaped by trees, stone, and time. When night falls and sound behaves differently, it reveals subtle movement and quiet echoes. Along the paths, shadows still seem to twist among the oaks. Within the empty rooms, faint cries still drift and fade. And when daylight returns, the motel releases its hold, remaining silent once more, a solitary structure overlooking the valley, carrying the quiet weight of what was once felt within its walls. Black Pine Motel clings to the edge of a narrow cliff road where tall pine trees rise in dense ranks, their trunks casting long shadows across rock and pavement. Its walls are faded by sun and wind, and the roof bears the marks of countless seasons. The motel sits close to the forest, so close that branches seem to lean toward the balconies. The drop beyond the cliff is steep, disappearing into layers of trees and mist far below. Even in daylight, the view carries a sense of distance and isolation. The air smells of resin and cold stone, and the wind moves unpredictably along the ridge, carrying sound away before it can settle. As evening approaches, the forest darkens quickly. Sunlight fades behind the pines, and shadows stretch across the motel grounds. The trees block the last of the light, leaving the building wrapped in dimness while the sky above remains faintly bright. The temperature drops, and the wind softens into slow, uneven currents that move through branches and along the cliff face. At night, Black Pine Motel feels suspended between forest and void. The parking area grows quiet, and the balconies overlook a darkness that seems deeper than the valley below. The balconies overlook a darkness that seems deeper than the valley below. The pine trees stand close together, their trunks forming vertical corridors of shadow. Light from the sky barely reaches the ground, and the forest appears thicker, closer, more attentive. The forest appears thicker, closer, more attentive. It is between the trunks that movement begins to appear. Figures stand just inside the tree line, partially hidden by bark and darkness. Their shapes are upright and human in outline, but details remain indistinct. They do not step forward. They remain positioned between trunks, framed by shadow, watching the open space around the motel. These figures appear briefly, then fade, only to reappear farther along the forest edge. They move without sound, shifting positions with quiet patience. When watched directly, they thin and dissolve. When attention drifts, they return, occupying the same narrow spaces between trees. Visitors walking near the edge of the lot or along the balconies often feel a subtle change in the air. Cold fingers brush lightly against an arm. A brief contact grazes the wrist or elbow with unmistakable precision. The touch is cool and fleeting, gentle enough to avoid alarm. It does not resemble wind or fabric. It feels deliberate, as though placed rather than accidental. Turning reveals no one nearby. The figures remain among the pines, unchanged and silent. Yet the chill from the contact lingers for a moment, spreading faintly before fading. As visitors move along the motel walkway, the sensation repeats. Always brief. Always careful. The touches occur most often near the forest edge, where the shadows grow deepest and the trees stand closest to the building. Black Pine Motel once served travelers navigating the mountain road, a narrow route carved along the cliffside. Drivers stopped here to rest before continuing through steep curves and dense forest. The pines offered shelter from wind, and the elevation provided clear views during daylight hours. Over time, traffic slowed. Roads were rerouted. The motel closed, leaving the building and the forest to stand together in silence. Some believe the figures reflect that history. Shapes lingering where people once walked among trees. Touches echoing brief contact in tight spaces where travelers passed one another in low light. The forest seems to remember movement even when no one remains. As night deepens, the figures between the trunks become more frequent. They appear closer together now, standing in staggered positions along the tree line. None step into open ground. None approach the building. They remain confined to the spaces between trees, as if bound to those narrow corridors of shadow. The sensation of cold fingers becomes slightly more noticeable. A brush against the forearm. A light touch near the shoulder. The contact remains careful and restrained, never gripping, never pulling. It passes and withdraws, leaving only a faint chill. Despite the unsettling nature of the experience, panic rarely takes hold. The atmosphere does not feel aggressive. The figures do not advance. The touches do not escalate. Everything unfolds within quiet limits, measured and controlled. Those who stop moving notice an immediate shift. The touches fade. The figures seem to retreat deeper into the forest, becoming harder to distinguish from darkness. The air grows still, balanced, waiting. When movement resumes, the activity returns. Figures reappear between trunks. Cold brushes pass once more along exposed skin. The motel feels attentive rather than reactive, acknowledging presence without interference. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited results. Photographs show dense forest and empty walkways. Video footage captures shifting shadows that resist clear form. Audio recordings reveal only wind through branches and distant sounds carried away by elevation. Environmental explanations suggest low light, dense tree cover, and temperature changes heighten sensation. These explanations account for individual elements, but not the consistency or precision of the reported touches. As the night reaches its quietest hours, activity begins to lessen. The figures appear less often, dissolving more quickly into shadow. The sensation of cold fingers stops without notice. The forest and motel settle into deep stillness, holding only wind and darkness. By early morning, Black Pine Motel appears unchanged. Sunlight filters through the pines, revealing empty walkways and silent balconies. The forest stands tall and ordinary once more. No figures remain. No sensation follows movement. Visitors leaving at dawn often pause near the cliff edge, looking back at the building framed by trees. In daylight, the motel seems peaceful and abandoned, offering no hint of what the night contained. Yet those who walked its grounds after dark remember clearly. Shapes watching from between pine trunks. Cold fingers brushing past in still air. The feeling of being acknowledged by a place where forest and stone quietly converge. Black Pine Motel remains perched along the cliff, weathered by wind and time. By day, it offers wide views and quiet shade. When darkness gathers beneath the pines and the valley below disappears from sight. Figures sometimes return to the spaces between trunks. Cold fingers brush lightly against passing arms. And for a brief time, the motel remembers the travelers who once paused here. Before silence settles again and the forest keeps its watch. Ghost-like Cliff Motel sits high above a wide desert basin where rock falls away into open space and the horizon stretches without interruption. The building clings to the cliff edge, its long balconies facing outward toward sand, stone, and distant mountains. By day, the motel feels exposed yet calm, shaped by sun and wind. By night, it becomes something else entirely. The desert around the motel is vast and quiet. During daylight hours, heat rises from the ground in visible waves. And the air carries the faint scent of dust and dry stone. The cliff edge offers sweeping views that draw visitors to the railings. Where silence feels expansive rather than empty. The motel itself appears practical and weathered. Built to endure harsh conditions rather than comfort. As the sun lowers, shadows lengthen quickly across the balconies. Light fades unevenly, leaving some sections in brightness while others fall into deep shade. The desert cools fast, and wind moves along the cliff face in slow currents. Sound changes here at dusk. Voices seem to fall away instead of carrying outward, as if absorbed by the open space below. It is just after sunset that the lanterns begin to appear. Soft glowing lights lift into view along the balconies, floating gently at waist height. No chains support them. No hands guide them. They drift steadily along the railings, casting warm light across concrete floors and metal doors. The glow is constant, neither flickering nor dimming, and it illuminates only what is immediately near. Visitors often pause when they notice the lanterns, unsure if they are decorative or imagined. The lights move calmly, never colliding, never changing speed. They trace the length of the balconies as if following paths worn into the air itself. Inside the rooms, something watches. Figures are seen standing silently within doorways and near windows, their forms pale against the darker interiors. Looking directly at the figures makes their outlines soften. They blur slightly, blending into shadow and reflected light. Looking away allows them to remain, holding their position without change. When doors are opened, the rooms are empty, untouched, and quiet. As darkness deepens, desert mist begins to rise. It creeps upward from the basin below, thin at first, then thicker as night settles. The mist clings to the cliff face and drifts across the balconies, softening edges and dulling sound. Within it, pale faces are sometimes seen, emerging briefly before dissolving again. Their features are indistinct but undeniably human. They show no expression. They do not speak. They linger only long enough to be recognized, then fade back into the moving haze. Visitors describe the experience as unsettling but restrained. Nothing rushes. Nothing lunges. The lanterns continue their slow movement. The figures remain still. The faces appear and vanish without pattern. The motel feels aware rather than aggressive, as if acknowledging presence rather than reacting to it. Sound behaves strangely at night. Footsteps echo lightly along the balconies, sometimes continuing after walking stops. Whispers drift through the mist, too soft to form words, carried on wind that feels deliberate rather than random. Occasionally, faint laughter rises from somewhere below the cliff, distant and gentle, never sharp, never close. The desert itself seems to respond. Mist thickens and thins in slow cycles. Wind shifts direction without warning, carrying sound from unexpected places. Standing still often brings a sense of being observed from multiple directions at once, not watched by eyes, but noticed by space itself. Historical records of ghost-like Cliff Motel are sparse. It was built during a brief period of desert tourism, when remote views and isolation were valued over convenience. Travelers came for the scenery and the silence. Over time, routes changed and traffic declined. The motel remained open longer than expected, sustained by habit and the draw of the cliff rather than demand. Local belief suggests the motel adapted to its surroundings. According to long-held stories, the lanterns mirror lights once carried by late-arriving guests. The figures in rooms reflect moments of arrival frozen in time. The faces in the mist belong to the desert itself, shaped by memory and reflection rather than identity. Visitors who stay overnight often report changes in perception. Hallways feel longer than before. Balconies seem to curve slightly, encouraging slow movement rather than direct paths. The lanterns feel comforting at first, then unsettling as their source remains unexplained. The figures in rooms appear more frequently near midnight, then less as dawn approaches. One visitor described standing beneath a floating lantern as mist rolled across the balcony. A pale face appeared briefly beyond the railing, then vanished. Inside a nearby room, a figure stood motionless by the window. The visitor felt no fear, only the sense of being present in a place that was quietly active. Another account tells of a couple who walked the length of the balcony late at night. Lanterns floated ahead and behind them. Faces appeared in the mist at varying distances. When they returned to their room, a figure stood silently inside, then disappeared without sound. Despite its reputation, ghost-like Cliff Motel does not feel hostile. Nothing blocks exits. Nothing follows too closely. The lanterns do not mislead aggressively, and the figures do not approach. Everything unfolds at a measured pace, allowing visitors to remain aware without panic. As night moves toward morning, activity begins to fade. Lanterns drift more slowly, then hover before dissolving into darkness. Figures in rooms vanish, leaving interiors empty and still. Faces appear less frequently as mist thins and settles back into the basin below. By dawn, the motel returns to normal. The desert stretches wide and silent once more. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. Ghost-like Cliff Motel appears peaceful, even inviting, its dramatic location framed by endless desert. Only those who have been there at night remember the floating lanterns, the silent figures, and the pale faces emerging from the mist. Ghost-like Cliff Motel exists at the meeting point of height, silence, and memory. When night falls, lanterns float along balconies with no hand holding them. Figures stand silently in rooms. Pale faces emerge from desert mist, then fade again. The motel does not announce itself as haunted. It does not seek attention or fear. It simply reflects the vast stillness around it, holding light, shadow, and presence in careful balance. Until morning returns and the desert reclaims its quiet. Ashwood Motel sits beside a quiet stretch of road that no longer carries much traffic. The building is low and rectangular, its exterior faded by years of sun and rain. By day, the motel appears empty and motionless, its windows dark, its doors closed, its long walkways exposed to open air and silence. The structure was built for travelers passing through, offering simple rooms and an easy stop before continuing on. Over time, the road lost importance, and fewer vehicles turned in. Eventually, the motel closed, leaving behind a place that feels paused rather than erased. During daylight hours, Ashwood Motel is completely still. The hallways stretch in straight lines, identical doors repeating without variation. Paint peels in places, and concrete floors show cracks shaped by weather and neglect. The air feels dry and flat, carrying no sound beyond distant wind. Inside the rooms, little remains. Furniture is gone, leaving pale outlines on walls where beds and tables once stood. Curtains hang loosely, barely moving. Every space feels hollow, as if emptied carefully and then left alone. The quiet during the day feels deliberate. Even footsteps sound restrained, absorbed quickly by open space. Visitors often remark on how calm the motel feels, like a building resting rather than abandoned. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to shift. Shadows lengthen across the walkways, settling beneath doorframes and along railings. The light fades unevenly, leaving parts of the motel dim while others still catch the last of the sun. Night arrives slowly at Ashwood Motel. Darkness fills the hallways first, then spreads into the rooms. Moonlight reflects faintly off windows and metal fixtures, creating narrow bands of light that break the darkness without fully dispelling it. It is after nightfall that movement returns. Shadows begin to glide along the hallways, separating from the shapes that should create them. They trace the length of the walkways, pause near doorways, then continue forward. Their movement is steady and unhurried, shaped by repetition rather than reaction. Observers often notice them indirectly. A shift occurs where nothing should move. When attention turns directly toward them, the shadows slow or merge back into the darkness, becoming indistinguishable from the night. The shadows never enter the rooms fully. They linger near thresholds, along walls, or beneath overhangs. They do not cross into the open road or move beyond the motel itself. Sound begins to accompany the shadows as the night deepens. Soft footsteps echo across the vacant rooms and hallways. The sound is gentle and measured, the rhythm of someone walking without hurry. Each step produces a faint hollow echo, bouncing briefly off concrete and walls before fading. The footsteps travel along the hallways, past door after door, then shift direction, as though turning a corner or reaching the end of a walkway. When a listener stops moving, the footsteps often continue briefly, then pause as well. Starting to walk again brings them back, maintaining distance without ever closing it. Turning around reveals empty corridors and closed doors. The footsteps do not rush or retreat. The sound never overlaps with visible movement. No shadow aligns perfectly with the echo. Historical records describe Ashwood Motel as busiest at night. Travelers arrived late, checked in under dim exterior lights, and walked the corridors to their rooms while others slept. Staff patrolled the walkways, listening for movement and ensuring doors were secure. The motel was designed to carry sound easily. Long, open hallways allowed footsteps to travel, and identical rooms created repeating echoes. These features once served practical purposes, shaping how the building functioned. When the motel closed, these design elements remained. The building kept its shape, its corridors, its acoustics. Only the people were removed. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects this long history of routine. The shadows glide where people once walked. The footsteps repeat paths worn into concrete by years of use. The motel appears to remember motion more than presence. Visitors often describe the experience as unsettling but controlled. The shadows do not approach. The footsteps do not chase. Everything unfolds with distance and repetition, as if governed by patterns that no longer require participants. Sound behaves unpredictably here at night. Wind can briefly mask footsteps, then allow them to return more clearly. Echoes linger longer than expected, making it difficult to judge direction or distance. Those who remain inside for extended periods report a subtle distortion of time. Minutes stretch longer than expected. Silence between sounds feels heavier. Leaving the motel often feels abrupt, like stepping out of a contained space. Attempts to document the activity rarely succeed. Photographs capture empty hallways and dark rooms. Video footage shows only shifting shadows cast by moonlight. Audio recordings pick up wind and distant noise, but footsteps often fade before registering clearly. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Shadows glide less often and become less distinct. Footsteps grow softer, spaced farther apart, eventually blending with the sound of wind moving through the open structure. By the hours before dawn, Ashwood Motel returns to near stillness. The hallways lie empty. The rooms remain silent. The darkness begins to thin as the sky lightens. At sunrise, the motel looks unchanged. Daylight reveals cracked concrete, faded paint, and long rows of closed doors. No sign remains of shadows or sound from the night before. Authorities describe Ashwood Motel as structurally sound but inactive, discouraging entry due to liability and neglect. There are no warnings posted about movement or sound, only notices about safety and access. Those who have experienced the motel at night often carry lingering impressions. The memory of shadows gliding along hallways. The echo of soft footsteps across vacant rooms. The sense that the building becomes active not with life, but with habit. Ashwood Motel does not feel hostile or inviting. By day, it rests in silence. By night, it remembers how it once moved. When morning returns, the motel settles again into stillness, holding its empty rooms and long corridors. Waiting quietly for darkness to return and allow shadow and sound to pass through once more. Widowmaker Cliff Motel stands along the edge of a sheer rock face, where the land drops away into a wide, shadow-filled canyon. The building is long and narrow, its structure anchored into stone that has weathered centuries of wind and rain. From a distance, the motel appears suspended between earth and sky, exposed to open air on one side and dense rock on the other. The site carries a heavy reputation. Over the years, multiple disappearances have been connected to the motel. Guests arrived, checked in, and were later found missing without clear explanation. Vehicles were left behind. Rooms remained undisturbed. Searches of the surrounding cliffs and trails yielded few answers. The unanswered nature of each case slowly shaped the motel's name. Sunlight reflects off the cliff face and the motel's windows, creating sharp contrasts of light and shadow. The wind moves constantly here, pushing against railings and whispering along the walls. The canyon below appears vast and silent, its depth difficult to judge from above. Balconies line the outer edge of the building. They face directly toward the open drop, protected only by simple railings. From these walkways, the view stretches far into the distance, where rock formations fade into haze. Standing there, visitors often feel a strange pull toward the open space, as if the horizon itself demands attention. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to change. The sun sinks behind the cliffs, and shadows spread quickly across the balconies. The wind cools, carrying distant sounds that seem to rise from below rather than from any visible source. It is after nightfall that the most unsettling reports begin. Figures appear suddenly on the balconies, standing where moments earlier there was nothing. The figures do not linger long. They stand near the railings, facing outward toward the canyon, motionless and silent. After several seconds, they fade just as abruptly as they appeared, dissolving into shadow without stepping away or turning back. Witnesses often describe the suddenness as the most disturbing aspect. There is no approach, no gradual emergence. One moment the balcony is empty. The next, a figure occupies the space. The absence of movement makes the appearance feel unnatural, as if time itself briefly skipped. Alongside the sightings come the sounds. Distant cries drift up from the canyon, carried by the wind in low, uneven waves. Interwoven with the cries are whispers. They are soft and fragmented, brushing the edges of hearing without forming words. The whispers seem to move with the air, circling the balconies and slipping past open doors before fading again into silence. These sounds are difficult to locate. They do not come from a single direction. At times they seem to rise from below. At other moments they feel closer to the building itself. The shifting nature of the sound creates a sense of disorientation, as though the environment is responding to presence rather than producing noise on its own. Visitors often report an emotional response rather than fear. The experience feels isolating. Combined with the sudden appearance of figures, the atmosphere suggests interruption rather than pursuit. Researchers studying the area point to environmental factors. Cliffs can distort sound, reflecting and amplifying noise from great distances. Wind moving through rock formations can create tones resembling voices. Sudden changes in light and shadow may trigger the perception of figures where none exist. The figures appear only at night. They always stand near the railings. The cries and whispers occur under similar conditions, regardless of weather or season. Patterns emerge that feel tied to the site itself. Some believe the disappearances left an imprint. That unresolved moments, cut short without explanation, shaped the environment. The figures may represent pauses in time rather than entities. The sounds may reflect emotion rather than speech. Others believe the cliff plays a central role. Standing at the edge creates heightened awareness. Sound, movement, and shadow take on exaggerated significance. The motel's position may amplify sensations that would pass unnoticed elsewhere. Those who remain at Widowmaker Cliff Motel after dark often describe a shift in perception. Time feels slower. The space feels larger and more exposed. The figures do not approach visitors. The sounds do not escalate. The motel does not appear to act upon those who stay. It reveals, then retreats. As the night deepens, activity gradually fades. Figures appear less frequently, dissolving more quickly into darkness. The cries soften, carried farther away by the cooling air. The whispers thin into indistinct sound, then disappear entirely. By early morning, Widowmaker Cliff Motel returns to stillness. Sunlight reaches the balconies. The canyon reveals its details once more. The building stands unchanged, silent against the cliff face. No trace of the night's activity remains. Yet those who leave often carry a lingering impression. That moments of absence shaped it as deeply as stone and steel. The sense that the place holds unfinished stories. It does not announce itself or seek attention. It stands at the edge of land and void, shaped by isolation, repetition, and unanswered questions. When night falls and sound travels differently, it reveals subtle movement and distant voices. From the canyon below, cries and whispers still drift upward. And when daylight returns, the motel releases its hold, remaining quiet once more, a solitary structure perched above the depths, carrying echoes of disappearances that refuse to fully fade. Misty Pines Motel rests along a narrow cliff road where tall pine trees crowd the edge of the land and the ground drops sharply into darkness below. The forest stands close on all sides. Pine trunks rise straight and dense, their branches forming a high canopy that filters light and muffles sound. Even in daylight, the motel feels separated from the world beyond the ridge, as though the forest has slowly claimed it. As night approaches, the air begins to cool rapidly. Fog forms deep in the valley and climbs steadily upward, threading its way between the pines. It arrives without sound, drifting low along the ground before rising to wrap the cliffside in pale layers. The trees fade into tall silhouettes, and the edge of the land becomes harder to judge as distance disappears. Once the fog settles, sound changes. Footsteps along the motel paths grow soft and distant. Wind moves gently through the canopy but feels absent at ground level. The world narrows to a few visible steps ahead, framed by tree trunks and faint outlines of railings. It is then that movement begins to appear. Figures glide silently along the paths that connect the motel rooms. Their outlines are human but indistinct, softened by the fog that refuses to part around them. These figures do not walk in a way that suggests weight. They move smoothly, effortlessly, drifting along curves in the paths and passing between trees without sound. Some follow the route along the cliff edge. Others move closer to the building, appearing briefly beneath balconies before fading back into the fog. A light brush passes along an arm. Fingers graze the wrist or forearm with cool, fleeting contact. The sensation is unmistakable, precise, and gentle. It does not feel like wind or shifting clothing. It feels placed, as though acknowledging presence rather than interrupting it. Turning reveals no one nearby. The fog drifts lazily. The figures continue gliding at a distance, unchanged by reaction. Yet the chill from the contact lingers briefly before fading. As visitors move farther along the paths, the sensations repeat. A brief touch near the elbow. A cool brush at the shoulder. The contact never grips or pulls. It arrives and fades, leaving only a faint impression behind. The pine trees surrounding the paths appear closer together at night, their trunks forming narrow corridors that guide movement. The fog thickens between them, blurring edges and softening depth. The cliff edge becomes a suggestion rather than a visible drop, felt more than seen. Misty Pines Motel once served travelers navigating the mountain road, offering rest before steep descents and winding turns. Guests arrived at dusk, parking beneath the trees and walking the paths to their rooms with luggage in hand. Lights once glowed through windows, and voices carried softly through the forest. Over time, traffic shifted to safer routes. The motel closed, leaving behind empty rooms and quiet paths. The forest continued to grow, and fog continued to rise from the valley below. Some believe the figures reflect that history. Movement repeating where people once walked. As night deepens, the figures appear more frequently. They glide in pairs or alone, never colliding, never interacting. Their movement feels practiced, tracing the same curves again and again. They do not acknowledge visitors directly. They remain focused on their paths, drifting calmly through fog and shadow. The sensation of unseen hands becomes slightly more noticeable near the cliff edge. A brush along the forearm. A cool pass near the back of the hand. The contact remains careful and restrained, as if guided by quiet rules. Despite the unsettling nature of the experience, panic rarely sets in. The atmosphere does not feel threatening. The figures do not rush or surround. The touches do not intensify. Everything unfolds slowly, with measured calm. Those who stop walking notice an immediate change. The figures thin into the fog, becoming harder to distinguish. The sensation of touch fades completely. The forest grows still, balanced, waiting. When movement resumes, the activity returns. Figures glide once more along the paths. Cool brushes pass again along exposed skin. The fog curls subtly around motion before settling again. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited results. Photographs show fog-filled paths and empty walkways. Video footage captures drifting mist with vague movement that resists focus. Audio recordings reveal only wind in the canopy and distant night sounds. Environmental explanations suggest temperature changes and dense fog heighten perception. Low visibility and isolation may contribute to unusual sensations. These explanations account for parts of the experience, but not its consistency or timing. As the night reaches its quietest hours, activity begins to lessen. The figures glide more slowly, appearing farther apart. The sensation of unseen hands fades gradually, leaving only cool air and stillness. The fog begins to lift slightly, loosening its hold on the ridge. By early morning, Misty Pines Motel appears unchanged. Visitors leaving at dawn often pause near the cliff edge, looking back at the motel framed by tall trunks and thinning mist. In daylight, it seems peaceful and abandoned, offering no hint of what the night contained. Yet those who walked the paths after dark remember clearly. Figures gliding silently through the fog. The feeling of sharing space with something present but unseen. Misty Pines Motel remains perched along the ridge, surrounded by forest and cloud. By night, when fog rolls through the pines and the world narrows to shadow and breath, the motel sometimes remembers its past. Figures return to the paths. Unseen hands pass gently in the dark. And for a brief time, the ridge feels less empty. Before the fog lifts, the movement fades. And the forest settles back into silence. Blackroot Cliff Motel sits along a sheer rock face where the land breaks suddenly into open air. The structure follows the curve of the cliff, its wooden walkways and railings suspended above a vast drop that disappears into darkness long before the ground can be seen. During the day, the motel appears weathered but functional. Sunlight reveals pale wood, worn smooth by years of exposure. Doors line the exterior corridors in a neat row, each one opening to the same narrow walkway that overlooks the canyon below. Wind moves freely here, carrying the distant sound of air rushing far beneath the cliff. Even in daylight, the height creates a sense of unease, as if the ground itself is unsure of its grip. When night arrives, Blackroot Cliff Motel transforms. Moonlight washes over the structure, and the wood appears black beneath its glow. Railings, floorboards, and doorframes absorb the light instead of reflecting it, turning the walkways into dark paths suspended against the sky. Depth becomes difficult to judge. The edge of the cliff feels closer, more immediate, as though the darkness below is pulling attention toward it. The air cools rapidly after sunset. Wind slides along the cliff face in steady currents, brushing the underside of the motel. Sounds stretch and thin, footsteps echoing outward before dissolving into nothing. The motel grows quiet, not empty, but watchful. It is during these hours that figures begin to appear. They emerge briefly along the walkways and near the railings, forming out of shadow just long enough to be noticed. Upright shapes stand where moments before there was nothing. They do not walk or gesture. They simply exist for a few seconds, then vanish without movement, as if drawn back into the dark wood beneath the moonlight. Looking directly at the figures causes them to fade more quickly. Seeing them at the edge of vision allows them to linger. Visitors often describe a strange sense of familiarity rather than fear, as though the figures belong to the place and are merely surfacing for a moment. As the night deepens, sound begins to return in an unsettling way. Faint chanting drifts across the motel, carried by the wind that moves along the cliff. The sound is low and layered, never forming clear words. It rises and falls gently, circling the building rather than approaching from any single direction. The chanting feels distant and close at once, as if the air itself is shaping the sound. Some visitors hear it clearly. Others feel it more than hear it, a vibration that settles briefly in the chest before passing. The sound does not grow louder when acknowledged, nor does it fade when ignored. It remains steady, woven into the rhythm of the wind. Under moonlight, the blackened floorboards appear to deepen in color, as though absorbing both light and sound. Standing still can create the illusion that the walkway is subtly angled toward the railing. Those who walk slowly often feel steadier than those who rush, as if the motel favors measured movement. Inside the rooms, the experience continues. Windows reflect the dark walkways and pale sky beyond. At times, movement appears in the glass that does not match anything outside the door. Shadows pass across walls without casting source. The chanting slips through closed windows, softened but persistent, carried by wind that seems to know the interior space. Historical records show Blackroot Cliff Motel was built during a period when remote travel was celebrated. Travelers came for the views, the silence, and the sense of standing at the edge of something vast. Over time, routes changed and traffic declined. The motel remained open longer than expected, maintained more out of habit than necessity. Local belief suggests the motel adapted rather than faded. According to long-held stories, the figures reflect moments of arrival and departure repeated too many times to disappear. The chanting mirrors voices once carried across the cliff at night, absorbed by wind and stone. The darkened wood remembers every footstep, every pause at the railing, every moment of hesitation. Visitors who stay late into the night often report changes in perception. Hallways feel longer. Doors seem farther apart. The chanting becomes harder to distinguish from the wind, yet more noticeable when silence follows. Figures appear more frequently just after midnight, then less as the night wears on. One visitor described standing near the end of the walkway. Moonlight turned the wood completely black. Chanting drifted past, carried by the wind without source. A figure appeared near the railing. Then vanished as soon as it was fully recognized. The visitor felt no panic, only the awareness of standing within a place that was listening. Another account tells of a guest who walked the corridor slowly, counting steps to remain calm. Figures appeared briefly in doorways ahead, fading as the guest approached. The chanting followed at a constant distance, neither closer nor farther. Until the guest returned inside and closed the door. Despite its unsettling reputation, Blackroot Cliff Motel does not feel hostile. Nothing blocks exits. Nothing lunges or reaches out. The figures do not pursue, and the chanting does not intensify. Everything unfolds slowly and deliberately, allowing visitors time to observe and choose their response. The tension comes from awareness rather than threat. Nothing blocks exits. Nothing lunges or reaches out. As night moves toward morning, the activity begins to fade. Figures appear less often. The wood remains dark, but its pull feels weaker, as if releasing what it held during the night. By dawn, the motel returns to its daytime state. Sunlight reveals pale wood once more. The walkways feel solid and ordinary. No chanting remains in the air. No figures stand near the railings. The cliff below becomes visible again, vast but measurable. The cliff below becomes visible again, vast but measurable. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. Blackroot Cliff Motel appears quiet and weathered, its location dramatic but calm. Its location dramatic but calm. Only those who have stood there under moonlight remember how the wood turned black, how figures emerged and vanished, how chanting rode the wind without words. Only those who have stood there under moonlight remember how the wood turned black, how figures emerged and vanished, how chanting rode the wind without words. Only those who have stood there under moonlight remember how the wood turned black, how figures emerged and vanished, how chanting rode the wind without words. Only those who have stood there under moonlight remember how the wood turned black, how figures emerged and vanished, how chanting rode the wind without words. Blackroot Cliff Motel exists where height, wind, and memory converge. When night falls, the structure responds. When night falls, the structure responds. Wood darkens beneath the moon. Figures surface briefly from shadow. Sound travels without source. When night falls, the structure responds. Wood darkens beneath the moon. Figures surface briefly from shadow. Sound travels without source. When night falls, the structure responds. Wood darkens beneath the moon. Figures surface briefly from shadow. Sound travels without source. When night falls, the structure responds. Wood darkens beneath the moon. Figures surface briefly from shadow. Sound travels without source. It does not warn. It does not invite. It simply waits at the edge of stone and sky, holding echoes of movement and voice until darkness returns and the wind carries them once more along the cliff. Hollowbrook Motel rests along a narrow cliffside road where land drops away into stone and shadow. The motel was built to take advantage of the view, its balconies facing open space and its paths winding carefully along the uneven terrain. By day, the motel appears calm and almost ordinary. The building is low and stretched out, with 2 levels of rooms connected by exterior walkways. Railings line the balconies, worn smooth by weather. The creek below can be heard faintly, its steady movement providing a constant background sound that blends with wind moving through the rocks. The paths around Hollowbrook Motel follow the natural shape of the cliff. Stone steps connect different sections, and narrow walkways hug the rock face. In sunlight, the area feels open and exposed. The sound of water and distant birds fills the space. Nothing about the scene suggests urgency. Inside the rooms, little remains. Furniture has been removed, leaving bare floors and pale outlines on walls. Curtains hang loosely, stirring only when air moves through broken seals around windows. The motel feels paused, as if waiting rather than abandoned. During daylight hours, Hollowbrook Motel is quiet to the point of stillness. Footsteps sound flat and brief, quickly absorbed by open air. The creek continues its steady flow, unchanged by the presence of visitors. Everything feels balanced and restrained. As evening approaches, shadows gather first along the cliff wall, where sunlight fades quickly. The creek darkens, reflecting less sky and more stone. Sound carries farther now, bouncing off rock surfaces and returning altered. Night settles slowly over Hollowbrook Motel. Moonlight outlines the balconies and railings, while the paths below dissolve into darkness. The creek becomes a thin ribbon of sound rather than sight, its presence known only by movement and echo. It is after nightfall that figures are most often reported. Visitors describe shapes moving along the balconies, passing from room to room with deliberate pace. These figures appear upright and human in outline, but lack detail. Their forms are defined by motion rather than features. The figures move calmly, never rushing or hesitating. They follow the length of the balconies, turn at corners, and continue along familiar routes. Some pause briefly near doorways, then resume walking. When attention is focused directly on them, the figures often fade into shadow, blending with darkness cast by the building itself. Looking away and back again may reveal them farther along the balcony, continuing as if uninterrupted. Movement is reported along the paths near the cliff. Figures appear to walk beside the rock wall, following the routes carved into the terrain. Their silhouettes rise and fall with changes in elevation, moving steadily along stone steps and narrow walkways. The figures do not disturb the environment. Loose stones remain still. Dust does not rise. The creek continues its flow without change. Everything about their movement feels integrated rather than intrusive. Sound plays a significant role at Hollowbrook Motel at night. Visitors hear footsteps on the rocks below and along the paths, clear and measured. The sound carries upward, echoing softly against the cliff face before fading. The footsteps follow a consistent rhythm, matching the pace of a calm walk. They travel along stone paths, cross gravel, and move beneath balconies. The sound shifts naturally with surface changes, adding to its realism. When listeners stop moving, the footsteps often continue briefly, then pause as well. Starting to walk again may bring them back, maintaining distance without approaching. Looking over the railing reveals empty paths and still rocks. The footsteps never overlap with visible movement. No figure appears where the sound originates. The echoes exist independently, shaped by stone, air, and the natural acoustics of the cliff. Historical records indicate Hollowbrook Motel was popular with travelers who arrived late and departed early. The paths and balconies were often active at night, with guests moving between rooms, cars, and scenic overlooks. The creek served as a landmark, guiding travelers through darkness. Over time, erosion and shifting routes reduced access to the area. Traffic declined, and maintenance slowed. Eventually, the motel closed, leaving its structure intact but unused. The paths remained, carved too deeply into the land to disappear quickly. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects these long years of movement. The figures on balconies echo guests walking familiar routes. The footsteps on rocks repeat paths worn smooth by countless crossings. The motel appears to remember motion rather than people. Visitors often describe the experience as unsettling but controlled. The figures do not approach. The footsteps do not chase. Everything unfolds with distance and repetition, as if governed by patterns that continue without intention. Sound behaves unpredictably here at night. The creek masks some footsteps while amplifying others. Echoes return from unexpected directions, making it difficult to judge location. Attempts to document the activity rarely succeed. Video footage captures shifting shadows cast by moonlight. Audio recordings pick up water and wind, but footsteps often fade before registering clearly. Time perception can shift while standing at Hollowbrook Motel at night. Minutes stretch longer than expected. Silence between sounds feels heavier. Leaving the area often feels abrupt, like stepping out of a contained environment. Activity gradually diminishes. Figures appear less often and fade more quickly. Footsteps become softer and more spaced out, eventually blending with the sound of the creek. By the hours before dawn, the motel returns to near stillness. The balconies lie empty. The paths are quiet. The creek continues its steady movement, unchanged and grounding. At sunrise, Hollowbrook Motel looks exactly as it did before. Daylight reveals weathered railings, cracked stone, and empty rooms. No sign remains of figures or sound from the night before. Authorities describe the motel as structurally compromised due to erosion. They discourage entry, especially after dark. No warnings posted about sightings or sounds. Only notices regarding safety and unstable ground. Those who have experienced Hollowbrook Motel at night often carry lingering impressions. The image of figures moving along balconies and paths. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on rocks with no one present. The sense that the land and building continue their routines regardless of observation. By day, it rests quietly above the creek. By night, it allows movement and sound to return briefly, repeating patterns etched into stone and memory. When morning comes, the motel settles again into silence, overlooking the cliff and listening to the creek below, waiting patiently for darkness to return and allow those patterns to surface once more. Blood Willow Motel sits high above a narrow ravine where the land drops sharply into shadow and mist. The willows define the setting. They grow in uneven clusters along the cliff edge, their branches trailing downward and swaying even when the air seems still. Leaves brush against one another with a constant, quiet motion, creating a soft sound that never fully fades. At night, the trees appear to move independently, their rhythm slow and slightly out of step with the wind. During the day, Blood Willow Motel feels remote but calm. Sunlight washes over the cliff face, and the valley below fills with pale haze. From the balconies, the view stretches far into the distance, uninterrupted by buildings or roads. The willows cast long shadows across the ground, and the air smells faintly of damp leaves and stone. Paths leading to the motel wind between the trees. The ground is uneven, shaped by exposed roots and shifting soil. Footsteps sound muted here, absorbed by leaves and earth. Even in daylight, the space feels enclosed, as though the willows form a boundary between the motel and the rest of the world. As evening approaches, the atmosphere changes. Light fades first beneath the trees, leaving the motel outlined against a dimming sky. Shadows gather along the cliff edge and deepen beneath the hanging branches. Shadows gather along the cliff edge and deepen beneath the hanging branches. The willows continue to sway, their movement more noticeable as the surroundings grow still. The willows continue to sway, their movement more noticeable as the surroundings grow still. It is near nightfall that figures are first noticed. It is near nightfall that figures are first noticed. They crouch close to the edge of the cliff, partially hidden by roots and shadow. They crouch close to the edge of the cliff, partially hidden by roots and shadow. Their shapes are human in outline but indistinct, low to the ground and motionless. Their shapes are human in outline but indistinct, low to the ground and motionless. They appear balanced carefully near the drop, facing outward toward the open space beyond the cliff. The figures do not rise. They remain crouched, as if listening or watching. When observed directly, they often seem fixed in place. When attention shifts, their positions change subtly, appearing closer to the edge or farther back among the roots. Their presence feels deliberate, restrained, and quietly focused on the view below. As darkness settles fully, sound becomes more prominent. Whispers drift through the air, weaving between the willows and along the motel balconies. Alongside the whispers comes soft laughter. It is faint and brief, light in tone and strangely gentle. The sound appears without warning, then dissolves quickly into silence. It never grows louder or closer, remaining distant and subdued. These sounds seem tied to the trees. They are strongest near the cliff edge where the willows grow thickest. Stepping away from the trees often causes the whispers and laughter to fade, only to return when re-entering the shaded areas near the roots. The motel itself remains quiet. Doors do not open. Rooms stay dark. The activity feels external, bound to the land and trees rather than the building. Standing on a balcony, visitors often feel caught between structure and nature, uncertain where the sounds originate. Despite the unusual experiences, fear is not the dominant response. Most describe curiosity mixed with a sense of quiet unease. The figures do not approach. The sounds do not escalate. The environment feels aware rather than aggressive. Researchers studying similar locations suggest natural explanations. Willow branches moving against one another can create whispering sounds. Wind traveling along cliff faces may distort noise, producing tones that resemble laughter. Low light can make shadows appear shaped and intentional. Yet these explanations struggle to account for repeated patterns. The figures appear only at night. They remain crouched near the edge. Whispers and laughter follow similar timing and intensity across different visits. The willows sway even when nearby trees remain still. Some believe the cliff plays a central role. Open space creates heightened awareness. Sound travels unpredictably across drops and valleys. The edge itself may amplify subtle noises, returning them altered and expressive. Others believe the willows hold memory. Their roots stretch deep into soil shaped by years of human presence. People once stood here, speaking softly, sharing moments, and looking out into the distance. Over time, those habits may have settled into the environment, surfacing quietly when conditions align. Those who stay overnight often report vivid dreams. Dreams of standing at the edge, listening rather than speaking. Of laughter heard but never answered. Of figures crouched in shadow, watching the horizon. Upon waking, many feel contemplative rather than afraid. As the night deepens, activity slowly diminishes. The whispers become less frequent. The laughter fades into the sound of leaves brushing together. The figures near the edge appear briefly, then dissolve into darkness among the roots. By early morning, Blood Willow Motel returns to stillness. Sunlight reveals empty ground and quiet trees. The cliff edge appears unchanged. The willows continue their slow swaying, branches trailing over stone and air. No trace of the night remains. Yet those who leave often glance back. The memory of crouching figures and distant laughter lingers, difficult to dismiss. The experience feels less like an event and more like an atmosphere, something woven into the place itself. Blood Willow Motel does not demand belief or explanation. It exists at the boundary between solid ground and open space, surrounded by trees that never fully rest. When night falls and sound travels differently, it reveals subtle presence and quiet voices. Near the edge, figures still seem to crouch and watch. Among the willows, whispers and soft laughter still drift. And when daylight returns, the motel releases its hold. Standing silent once more above the ravine. Shaped by roots. Shadow. And the quiet persistence of moments that refuse to completely fade. Phantom Canyon Motel sits along a narrow road carved into the stone walls of a deep canyon. The land drops sharply on one side, while sheer rock rises on the other, enclosing the structure in shadow for most of the day. By daylight, the motel appears worn but intact, its concrete exterior faded by sun and wind. Long hallways stretch between rows of doors, and windows look out toward the canyon, offering views of layered rock and distant sky. As evening approaches, the canyon changes its character. Sunlight disappears early here, swallowed by towering walls that block the horizon. Cool air settles quickly, flowing down the stone like water. Sound behaves strangely in the canyon, echoing faintly and then vanishing, as if absorbed by the rock itself. When night fully arrives, the motel feels isolated from the world above. Darkness fills the canyon floor, and the sky becomes a narrow strip overhead. The hallways fall silent, their concrete floors holding the cold. Doors stand closed or slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. The motel seems empty, yet expectant. Then the lanterns appear. Soft pools of warm light bloom along the hallways, evenly spaced and hovering at a familiar height. The light does not flicker. It does not sway with the canyon air. Each lantern holds its position as if placed by an unseen routine that repeats night after night. As the hallways brighten, movement begins within the rooms. Figures rise slowly inside the empty spaces, assembling from shadow rather than stepping through doors. They form upright shapes near beds, walls, or windows, their outlines human but incomplete. Their edges blur into the darkness behind them, making detail impossible to distinguish. These figures do not exit the rooms. They remain inside, positioned just beyond the doorways, watching the hallways without stepping into them. When attention focuses on one, it softens and fades. When attention drifts, it returns, occupying the same place with quiet consistency. As the figures hold their positions, shadows begin to behave differently. Some shadows stretch naturally from doorframes and railings under the lantern light. Others detach completely, sliding across floors and walls without regard for light or structure. These independent shadows move slowly, tracing paths that do not match any visible source. They pass beneath the lantern glow without changing shape. They cross doorways and disappear briefly into rooms before re-emerging farther down the hall. Their movement feels deliberate, unhurried, and practiced. Despite the unsettling visuals, the atmosphere remains controlled. The lanterns continue to glow steadily. The figures remain contained within their rooms. The shadows glide without haste. Nothing rushes. Nothing intrudes abruptly. The canyon holds the scene in quiet balance. Phantom Canyon Motel once served travelers navigating remote desert routes that wound through steep terrain. Drivers stopped here to rest after long hours on isolated roads. Lantern-style lights once guided guests along the hallways at night, offering warmth against the canyon cold. As routes changed and traffic slowed, the motel closed. Doors were locked and later abandoned. The canyon remained, holding the building within its stone walls. Some believe the nightly phenomena reflect those past routines. Lanterns lighting familiar paths. Figures rising where travelers once stood or slept. Shadows continuing movement long after bodies have gone. Visitors who stand quietly in the hallways notice subtle changes. The figures inside rooms seem to pause, their outlines thinning slightly. Independent shadows slow, gathering briefly near corners before drifting apart again. The lanterns dim just enough to soften the glow, never fully fading. When movement resumes, the cycle continues. Figures regain clarity inside the rooms. Shadows slide freely across floors and walls. Lanterns return to their steady warmth, guiding empty corridors as they once did. Attempts to document the experience have produced limited clarity. Photographs show lantern light without visible fixtures. Dark shapes within rooms resist focus. Video footage captures shadows moving against walls without clear cause. Audio recordings reveal only distant wind and faint canyon echoes. Environmental explanations describe individual elements, but not their coordination or repetition. These explanations describe individual elements, but not their coordination or repetition. As the night deepens, activity reaches a quiet peak. Figures stand in multiple rooms at once, silent and still. Shadows move with greater confidence, crossing paths and sliding along surfaces as if following remembered routes. Then, gradually, the process begins to unwind. Figures thin and dissolve back into darkness, leaving rooms empty once more. Independent shadows lose cohesion, merging with ordinary darkness cast by walls and railings. Lanterns dim one by one, their light retreating until the hallways return to shadow. By the time night begins to loosen its hold, Phantom Canyon Motel stands quiet and dark. The canyon air moves softly. The building holds only stillness. At dawn, the motel appears unchanged. Sunlight spills down canyon walls, revealing empty hallways and vacant rooms. No lanterns remain. No shadows behave unusually. Nothing suggests the activity that filled the night. Those who leave after witnessing the darkness often describe a lingering sense of order rather than fear. The experience feels deliberate, as though the place follows routines it no longer needs explained. Phantom Canyon Motel remains enclosed by stone and silence. By day, it is an abandoned structure shaped by time and weather. By night, it sometimes resumes a quiet ritual shaped by light, form, and shadow. Not as a warning, and not as a threat, but as a reminder that some places remember how they were once used. And continue their patterns long after the road has emptied and the canyon has grown still. Darkwater Cliff Motel clings to the edge of a towering escarpment where stone drops away into open darkness. Built higher than any other structure in the region, it overlooks a vast expanse of rock and wind that seems to swallow sound and distance alike. By day, the motel appears stark and weathered, its long balconies tracing the cliff with deliberate precision. By night, it earns its reputation as the most haunted of all. The approach to the motel is narrow and winding. As vehicles climb higher, the air grows thinner and cooler. carrying the steady sound of wind rising from far below. The land feels exposed here, stripped of excess detail, leaving only stone, sky, and the looming presence of the building itself. Even before stepping onto the balconies, visitors often sense that the cliff is not merely scenery, but an active force. At sunset, the atmosphere shifts rapidly. Light drains from the horizon faster than expected, and shadows climb the motel walls. Shadows climb the motel walls. The cliff below becomes indistinct, losing shape and depth until it feels endless. Wind brushes along the underside of the balconies, causing railings to hum softly. The building creaks in response, settling into the coming night. It is then that figures begin to rise. They appear silently along the balconies, emerging from shadow near the railings and doorways. The figures stand upright and still, facing outward toward the void below. They do not climb into view or step forward. They simply rise, as if lifted by the cliff itself. Visitors who notice them often freeze. The figures do not react. They do not turn their heads or acknowledge being seen. Looking directly at them causes their outlines to soften, blurring slightly against the night sky. When attention drifts away, they seem clearer again, holding their positions in absolute silence. Moments later, the figures vanish. They do not retreat or fade gradually. They are simply no longer there, leaving empty balconies and steady railings behind. The space feels unchanged, yet the memory of their presence lingers. Soon after, ghostly lanterns appear. Soft lights float above the rooms and along the balconies, hovering just below the ceiling line. No chains hold them. No flames burn inside. The lanterns glow with a pale, steady light that illuminates doors, windows, and sections of the walkway while leaving everything else in shadow. They never collide. They never flicker wildly. Their movement is calm and deliberate. Many guests find themselves unconsciously following the glow, drawn deeper along the balconies without realizing it. As the night deepens, sound returns in fragments. Footsteps echo behind those walking the corridors, matching their pace with unsettling precision. When visitors stop, the footsteps continue for a moment, then fade into silence. Whispers slide through the air, brushing past like breath rather than voice. At times, faint cries rise from somewhere below the cliff, distant and indistinct, carried upward on the wind. The sounds never come from a single direction. They circle, drift, and return, creating the sensation of being followed without pursuit. Turning reveals empty walkways and floating lantern light, yet the awareness of company remains. Some say the cliff itself begins to move. Not violently, not suddenly, but subtly. The ground beneath the balconies feels slightly angled. Steps feel easier in one direction than another. Standing still can create the illusion that balance has shifted, as though the land is gently guiding rather than forcing. Those who do not notice it may find themselves closer to the railing than intended, heart racing without clear reason. Inside the rooms, the atmosphere remains heavy. Windows overlook the drop, reflecting lantern light and drifting shadow. At times, movement appears in the glass that does not match anything outside. Curtains stir without breeze. The sounds of footsteps and whispers seem closer here, slipping through walls and floors as though the building itself carries them. Historical records of Darkwater Cliff Motel are incomplete. It was constructed during a period when extreme locations drew travelers seeking isolation and awe. The views were unmatched. The silence was total. Over time, traffic declined, and fewer guests made the climb. The motel never officially closed, but rooms stood empty more often than not. Local belief suggests the motel never lost its purpose. According to long-held stories, the figures reflect watchers who once stood along the balconies night after night. The lanterns mirror old guide lights, meant to keep travelers oriented in darkness. The sounds echo movement and emotion absorbed by stone and air, released slowly when night falls. Visitors who remain late into the night often report distorted perception. Hallways feel longer. Distances stretch. The lanterns appear closer together than before. The sounds follow at a constant distance, neither approaching nor retreating. Fear arises not from threat, but from awareness of how easily direction can be lost. One visitor described walking the balcony beneath floating lanterns as figures rose silently near the railing ahead. Footsteps followed behind, stopping when he stopped. A faint cry drifted up from the cliff below. The ground beneath felt subtly sloped, guiding him forward until he stepped back deliberately and felt the sensation fade. Another account tells of a guest who stood motionless near a room door, listening to whispers circle the balcony. Lanterns hovered overhead. Figures appeared briefly on both sides, then vanished. The guest felt watched, yet unharmed, as if the motel was observing rather than judging. Despite its reputation, Darkwater Cliff Motel does not feel aggressive. Nothing pushes. Nothing grabs. The figures do not reach out, and the lanterns do not force a path. Everything unfolds slowly, deliberately, allowing visitors time to notice and choose awareness over panic. The danger lies not in attack, but in distraction. As night wears on, activity begins to fade. Lanterns drift more slowly, their glow thinning until it dissolves into darkness. Figures appear less frequently, rising and vanishing more quickly. Footsteps and whispers soften, blending into the steady sound of wind against stone. The subtle pull of the cliff weakens, releasing its hold. By dawn, the motel returns to stillness. Morning light restores depth to the cliff below. Balconies appear solid and ordinary. No lanterns remain. No figures stand near the railings. The air feels clear and stable once more. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. Darkwater Cliff Motel looks stark but peaceful, its position dramatic yet calm. Only those who walk the balconies at night remember the rising figures, the floating lanterns, the sounds that followed without source, and the way the cliff itself seemed to guide each step. Figures rise along balconies silently. Lanterns float above rooms. Sound follows without form. The cliff listens and responds, not with force, but with subtle guidance. Darkwater Cliff Motel exists at the edge of land and awareness. It does not call out. It does not warn loudly. It simply waits, balanced above the void. Revealing its quiet influence only to those who walk too close to the edge in the dark. Thank you, my dear friend, for walking with me tonight through the haunted cliffside motels of Arizona. These motels may seem quiet by day, but by night they are alive with shadows, whispers, and spirits that refuse to rest. If you ever wander along a cliffside motel at night, and fog drifts low, or shadows move along the hallways, or lanterns appear floating across balconies, remember this. Not every shadow is harmless. Not every plank or railing is safe. And not every figure belongs to the world of the living. Step carefully. Keep your lanterns close. And may the spirits of the cliffside leave you to return safely until our next haunted journey, my dear friend.